Hi, I'm Jeanette Peterson, writer and mindfulness coach. Welcome to the Art of Mindful Disruption, where I share conversations to help relax, motivate, ponder, and inspire you to grow. So sit back, relax, and enjoy a mindfulness meander with me as I traverse some topics that might just make you think a little differently about pretty much everything in life. Over time, I will challenge your ways of thinking and your emotions in ways that you may have never considered possible before. You see, mindful disruption is not about chasing solutions. It's more about building awareness and allowing the beautiful solutions to find you. So before we jump right into today's topic, let's take some moments to become present, relax a little. You may have been busy doing something, so just so you can slow down a little bit and get ready to be alert and listening in this present moment. So we're going to take some slow, nice breaths in through our nose and out through our nose. So as you breathe in slowly in through your nose, breathe that breath all the way down into your belly. Feel that stomach expand as you're filling all of your lungs to every space with air. And as we breathe out, we're slowly just letting go of the breath. We're not trying to force it out. We're just slowly letting it go very naturally, letting go of any tension that we might be holding. And then as we breathe back in again, we're taking that nice, long, slow, deep breath, filling up our lungs all the way down into our stomach, feeling that sense of air within us. You can hold it for a moment, and then slowly, as you turn it into an exhale, we're just allowing that air to slowly release through your nose and allow it to leave your body completely naturally. And let's just take one more. As we breathe in slowly in through our nose, take that breath all the way down into our belly and feel the expansion in your body. And as your in-breath turns into an out-breath, just slowly, naturally releasing that breath. Allow it to flow out back through your nose and release it all. So we should be feeling a little bit more relaxed, nice and present, so we can jump right in to today's conversation, which is an interesting one that might be familiar to more people than we tend to like to let on. We're going to talk about the liberation of letting go of perfection. That's right, I mentioned the P word, perfection. You know, that unattainable dream that we so often choose as our very own personal weapon of torture. If this is you, listen up, because as a reformed perfectionist myself, I can most definitely assure you that there is a much better road ahead. So before we really get into the depths of perfection and understand how we get caught up in it and how it can really grab you and grip you through such long periods of your life, consider first that every sunset is perfectly beautiful. In fact, I don't think anybody's ever told me that they saw a horrible sunset. Yet, the interesting thing about sunsets are that they're different every single day from every different viewpoint, yet they remain beautifully perfect. So this is an interesting thing to consider. So if the sun, regardless of where we see it, from what angle, it still remains beautiful, why is it that perfection seems to be this unattainable one thing that we're constantly reaching out for in an attempt to grip it? Yet for some reason it always just stays that little bit further out of reach of our grip. You see, being a reformed perfectionist, I was there on the perfection bandwagon. In fact, I was there in spades. I was obsessed with perfection, so bad that I often simply talked myself out of starting things for fear of failure to reach the unattainable status of perfection. It's a treacherous road ahead, especially to go down one of perfection, and I highly recommend you avoid the said road. So succinctly said by a reformed perfectionist, don't you think? It sometimes seems incredibly easier than done. So, where does all this perfection come from? Is it something that you learned as a behaviour? Or is it something that you could have been taught, that could have been passed down through generations? We know that it can lead to so many problems, including mental health problems, because when we become obsessed with perfection, that it can actually, as I said in my very opening sentence, seem like it turns into a form of torture. So where does it come from? Is it possibly, did you have a parent who was a perfectionist and they taught you that skill directly? Were you surrounded by perfectionists? And perfection comes in so many different ways when it shows up, particularly in the forms of conditioning. So sometimes you could have a perfectionist parent who is very tidy and very fastidious about tidiness. You know, we liken them, people in terms, we call them clean freaks. You know, people who are constantly tidying up and everything has its place and everything is very much structured. So if you're a child and you grew up in a space where, whether it was somebody who cared for you or whether it was your parents directly, someone you spent a lot of time around was very much focused on this meticulous order of things, then you could very much find yourself indirectly inheriting this behaviour of perfection. Now, they've probably inherited it from somewhere else as well, and this can go back through generations and generations. In fact, if you've still got generations of family alive, you might say, my children are perfectionists. Oh, whoops, they may have got that from me. But so is my mother, and I think I got it from her. And oh God, my grandmother is as well, and I think my mother might have got it from her. So you can see how this pattern could very well have arisen. But perfection comes up in other ways. So I was, as a child, quite a creative child, and my father taught me to draw. Now, my father was incredibly talented at drawing, and I would go as far as to say that I think I probably picked up some of his perfection and carried it through my life. So he liked to draw things perfectly, and I definitely adapted that quality. And there is other qualities that I can quite easily discover that I've picked up from people that I've been associated with in my life. So some of us are naturally drawn to this desire for perfection. We call it, striving for greatness, I think sometimes. And being a perfectionist is not always great. In fact, sometimes it's absolutely terrible. Sometimes it is so debilitating that it can literally stop you dead in your tracks. So what's the good news? Well, like many habits that are passed down, you actually have control as an adult, so you can choose to change. If you've inherited some amount of perfection from one or both of your parents or a grandparent or anybody in life that had a lasting effect, you can quite easily change that. It's a decision. So sometimes we hold on to these choices of becoming a perfectionist and we call it a skill. So that makes it really easy to hold on to it, doesn't it, when we say that it's a good quality. So if you go for a job interview one day and they say to you, tell us what your best skill and your worst skill are. And your best skill, you may label a number of different things that you're capable of. And then when you say your worst skill, you're using what you really class as your best skill as potentially the worst as well. And we know this because perfection can seem great when it comes together, but it can be absolutely terrible when it doesn't come together. But you can stop at any time. And really, it's just about taking small steps to start. And those small steps to liberate yourself so you can let go of perfection can come easier than you might think. For me, perfectionism was really a kind of mindset that I had. So I decided basically in my head that anything that was worth doing right. Does that sound familiar? Because I'm sure it must sound familiar to many people. But the problem is that concept becomes particularly difficult until it stops you dead in your tracks. And this has happened for me many times in my life, that when I was a child, if I couldn't achieve perfection, well, I simply just didn't want to do it at all. So I often refused to learn how to do new things if I thought that potentially I could fail or I wouldn't be good at it. So perfectionism is often fear of failure masked under the guise of perfection. So we know that the fear of failure can become an incredibly debilitating roadblock to success in life. And so when fear of failure is masquerading around as perfection, the very same thing happens. So one day, something interesting happened. I stumbled upon a principle of simply starting. And it's a phrase that I often use in coaching when speaking to clients and even when speaking to friends when they're struggling to escape the grips of perfection. And it really is all you have to do is start. Now, to a perfectionist, that sounds like the ultimate betrayal. So what do you mean, just start? Is what people usually say to me. Are you mad? We can't just start something. We have to have a plan for it. And a really common trait of a perfectionist is to like to plan out every step, 10 steps ahead of everybody else, and be fully prepared and planned. Well, the problem with this and trying to attain perfection is if you overplan, you could miss the opportunities to pivot and to try something different, when if you're fixed in your plan, you just won't do that at all. You'll keep marching on because that's the plan that you have. So perfection, that desire to achieve something that is perfectly in the view of the vision that you have in your mind for something, can be skewed by this absolute focus on the end goal in mind. So if you do this, then you're missing out on all these really incredible things around you. Now, when I discovered this concept of just starting, something really magical happened. Because when I just decided to start, the answers that I didn't have appeared exactly when I needed them. So letting go of the desire to control everything and the fear of failure if I didn't plan anything, it was difficult, don't get me wrong, it was uncomfortable. But I started to realise as I stepped into that space that as long as I could make the first decision, and sometimes that was just to head in a particular direction, that then the opportunities came, and with some great skills in awareness, I was able to see them when they arrived. So this didn't just happen once. The more I stuck with this, the more this happened time and time again. And I began to build what I would call absolute trust in the process of starting. So if you can imagine 30 years of my life, I planned out everything. I am a strategic thinker. So I tend to have a strategy and a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D. And when plan A doesn't work, I invoke plan B, and I'm already thinking about the next plan D because everything moved up the path. Now, this takes a lot of mind power to really constantly process and readjust your strategic thinking this way. Whereas to step back away from perfection and be prepared to walk along the process as it unfolds, then you start to see opportunities in a whole new way. And it was a valuable lesson that I learned in life as I started to practice this. And it serves me well right to this very day. In fact, what some people would now call procrastination, I actually call waiting. So sometimes, rather than chasing down a solution through perfection and planning, I head down a path, I become observant, and the solutions arise. I test them. Some of them are good ideas, some of them are viable, and some of them aren't. And so the ones that aren't, I sweep them to one side and I continue. And instead of finding myself along a path where I get to the end and I haven't really achieved what I wanted, I now meander along a path which is quite different. So in perfectionism, you usually have a very straight line in mind. You're very focused about getting from A to B. You know what B looks like, you know what you want from B, and you know that it's the outcome that you want. Whereas now, I can go from A to J to D to F to B and all the way through to Z if I choose to, and I get a much better outcome. So by giving up the idea of perfection needing to be laid out and articulated up front, I actually started to create better results in my life overall. But it took some really high quality skills to be able to tune this back. So let's step back into that concept of starting, because this is often the trickiest part of perfection. So if you're deciding to start, you need to set your next stopping point in mind. So I did this exact thing, and I've read lots of beautiful books about some of the concepts of these things, and one that kind of stands out in my mind is a beautiful book called Tiny Habits, which was written by a very clever man who happened to be the founder of a behaviour design lab at Stanford University, and he developed a beautiful system that focuses on small changes to change anything and everything. So with an emphasis on what he says about starting tiny. So if you're one of those people who's struggling with perfection, well then the principle of starting a change feels huge, right? And it creates big expectations in your mind about what you're trying to do. Whereas if you look back and you think about starting tiny, then you might find that the tiny way forward is going to be a better way forward to control that desire to be perfect. Now, the tiny system isn't the only system that's available to you to help escape the trap of perfection. There are lots of different ways and systems that you can use and adapt to help you see the way through the process. But what I find is one of the trickiest things is to see when you're getting locked in to focusing on perfection. And this is where all the unraveling begins to happen. So it's a little bit like meditation. All right, in mindfulness, it's really common that people say, oh, I can't meditate because my mind is so active and I can't slow it down. Well, that is like applying perfection to meditation, all right? Sure, if you've meditated for 10 years, you're probably very capable of slowing your mind down if it feels a bit rushed. But like anything new that you're beginning, you couldn't possibly do it straight up. So if you're a perfectionist and you try to meditate, you're going to have an expectation that you need to do it exactly right. When the first stage of understanding meditation is quite similar to the first stage of escaping perfectionism, and that is the stage of awareness. So becoming aware that you're applying perfectionist skills or perfectionism to what you're doing. So once you start to become aware, then you can actually start to enact change. So awareness starts in small increments. It's like in meditation when you're concentrating on your breathing. And if you do guided meditation, someone may say to you, now if your mind wanders away, come back to your breath. And when they say that in the guided meditation, when your mind wanders away, come back to your breath, you realise that your mind had wandered away for some time. And that is the point of time that you come back to your breath. So sometimes the same thing applies with perfectionism, is you found yourself on a really solid trajectory of trying to be perfect and do everything perfectly right before you've realised that you're there. But it doesn't really matter at what point you discover that you've headed along that path. The actual point is to discover, not to tell you when you must discover, because that is applying perfectionism to awareness. So when you're a perfectionist, you will find yourself applying perfectionism to everything. And I mean literally everything. True perfectionists, we're an appalling bunch of people to be surrounded by. We can drive people in our lives absolutely bonkers. I think I drove most people and some part of my life absolutely crazy. I folded everything perfectly. My shelves, I laid out things perfectly. Now, this is, as an adult. As a child, I just threw my clothes on the floor because as a child, I think that was my concept of it was perfect. Everything was everywhere. I could see everything and I knew what I needed. But as an adult, I had decided that perfect was actually everything laid out in a very orderly manner. Now, I discovered something really interesting about my desire to be perfect. In fact, I think I took perfectionism to a level of borderline craziness for myself, that I literally was so extreme in my perfection that even my thoughts I laid out in a ridiculous, orderly manner. In fact, my thoughts and the way I stored and collated and catalogued all the conversations and all the experiences within my life in such an orderly way that if the average psychiatrist or psychologist tapped into some of the goings-on of my teenage years into my 20s, they'd probably likely and happily spend time analysing the detail of my ability to compartmentalise my life in an incredible way. This is part of the process of perfectionism. So I did it for everything. I did it for my thoughts. I did it for my space. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with being tidy. In fact, a tidy workspace and a tidy home and a tidy space to live actually can help maintain a level of peacefulness and harmony. So tidiness in your mind as well can help create a level of peacefulness and harmony within. So it's when you take that level of tidiness to the whole next level that it all gets a little bit crazy. So let me give you an example of what I mean here. So I was a very active person for the majority of my adult life. There was always a sport that I was doing, and for a period of a fairly long time I was very actively into running. And so I was such a perfectionist that if I ran along a path and a gate was open, I'd have to stop and close the gate because it wasn't perfect. If I went into a shopping centre and the doormat that was entering that point of the shopping centre wasn't straight, I'd have to line it up. If there was a picture hanging on a wall in a friend's house that wasn't hanging straight, I'd have to straighten it. Now this is perfectionism gone mad. I think I may have almost drove myself crazy in some points, thinking, why am I stopping from running to close somebody's gate? Maybe they wanted it open. And, maybe my friend's house where they had their painting was on an angle. Maybe they didn't care that it was on an angle. So perfectionism can so heavily encroach into your mind and overtake all of your thoughts that you become so focused on that tiny detail that you're missing all the other things in life. And so I learnt to start to run, and instead of focusing on those things, once I'd picked up that my perfectionism was encroaching into my running, that I decided, well, instead of focusing on those things, I was going to focus on the lovely scenery that I was running past. And so I began to run around places like lakes and rivers and where there was lots of nature, and I was really starting to enjoy that space. So instead of being intent on fixing everything, I became much more intent on enjoying what existed around me. So this enabled me to become much more present. So perfectionism and understanding where it's beginning and how to slow it down and how to simply start new habits of reducing this desire to be perfect. You can start it in any space that you like. It's first and foremost about becoming aware that you're doing it in the beginning. And I mean, any habit to change, the first thing one must do is admit that we have a problem or a habit in the first place. If we don't think it's a problem or a habit that needs to be changed, well, we're not going to start, are we? So it's about understanding, well, maybe has perfectionism gotten you to a point in your life where it's starting to make your life difficult? And if it has, well, then potentially you know that it's a habit that might be worthwhile considering a change in. And so these are some of the things that very much can come up that could start through awareness, where you can see the point taking you forward. And as this awareness starts to build, you start to recognize the things that you're doing. But then with awareness, you start to see how your perfectionism is potentially driving the people around you absolutely mad as well. So often you're so hell-bent as a perfectionist on achieving the exact result that you need to have, whether it's you're drawing a picture, whether you're creating something, creatively, or whether you're doing a sporting activity or doing something for work. You are so hell-bent on achieving the perfect result that you actually unfortunately become quite oblivious to what's going on around you, and you can be quite oblivious to other people's inputs. And so the awareness actually lends itself quite beautifully as you start to become more aware of what your perfectionism is doing in your life, that you become aware of opportunities. So when you go into a meeting with this perfect view of how that meeting's due to look, if you learn to soften it a little bit and you gain some awareness, when you get to a point in that meeting where someone brings something up that's incredibly valuable and could actually take the work that you're doing in a much better direction, you'll see it because you're aware, and you will learn to pivot and move towards that, because a better outcome may actually be more closely connected to the idea that someone has brought to you. So travelling down the path of uncovering your perfection and seeing where the uncovering through that process of simply starting is unbelievably beneficial, not just to shake that constant torture of perfection, because let's face it, we often get to a point where we just don't achieve the way we expected it to look because it was completely unrealistic. But we can learn so much more about ourselves and about the people around us just through the awareness that we develop while we try to unshake that grip of perfectionism. So the next time you find yourself in a situation where you're feeling like the awareness is starting to rise and you might be gripped by perfection, the first thing to do is to stop. To stop and reassess. Take a look around, think about where you're going, and start to become more aware of your surroundings. Allow other people to interject into the space that you're in, to bring their ideas forward, and don't take all the burden upon yourself to provide a perfect result. Because in many circumstances, whether it be in your personal life or in your professional life, there are people around you that want to actively participate to produce a good outcome as well. So if you're hell-bent on being a perfectionist, sometimes you tend to think that it's left up to you to find the perfect solution. And when you start to become aware, you might just find that there are lots of people around that have some incredibly good solutions. And therefore, when you start to tap into those, you take away the burden of having to produce the solution all on your own. So we know that leaning into perfection through awareness and starting to see where it unfolds helps us to see other opportunities and see the people around us and how their inputs could actually help us produce a good result. But there's also a really another important thing that we need to do, and it's a word that we seem to find difficult to swallow, and it's the word of acceptance. So we need to learn to accept that the best work that we've done is enough. That the time frame that we were given to prepare that report, the report that we did in that time is enough. That the time we were given to write that assignment, the assignment that we handed in the time we were given, is enough. See, underlying perfection, there is another evil partner that sits in the background, and it's fear of not being enough. So look back into your life. If you find that some of this is resonating with you and that you understand that you're a bit of a perfectionist that yourself, well, start to look back and start to think, has there been some circumstances in your life where you felt that you weren't enough? Did you do something that you were remarked upon? So did you hand in an assignment that you were really proud of, but your teacher told you it was terrible and you got a bad mark for? Did you do something that you were really proud of and a parent said to you, oh, I think next time you can do better? And did it leave an imprint in your life? because these imprints could be the subtle understanding that you can gain to really start to learn where this perfectionism came from. So I think for me, I can clearly see many, many imprints that happened in the early years of my life that gave me those feelings of not being good enough, that I started to strive for perfection all the time through this desire to prove that I was good enough. But we actually don't need to prove anything. Everything that we do is good enough. The person we are in every moment, whether we make a mistake or whether we produce an exceptional result, we are always good enough. The foot that we put forward on the days when we're tired and we give it our best shot but we fall short, we're still good enough. We don't ever have to attain perfection to feel good enough within ourselves or for other people to think that we are good enough. I always, when I think of perfection, I always think of a beautiful saying that my mother used to say to me when I was a child, and I don't think she ever stopped saying it to me until the day she died, because occasionally I think she felt she always needed to, as my mother, to pull me up. She used to say to me, "Jeanette, it's none of your business what other people think." So when I think of perfection, I always think of, am I focusing on what other people think? Do I feel like personally I've done enough? Do I feel like I've given it my best shot? Do I feel like I tried with everything that I had? And if I can answer yes to those questions, well then I know I've done my best work. And if my best work wasn't the best for the job, then it was okay, because I did the best that I could. And I've learnt to let go of the grip of perfection. Once you develop into a perfectionist, it's a tricky path to completely let go of it. Sometimes the perfectionist weapon of torture pops up in my life in random circumstances, and thankfully I have people around me that remind me occasionally that things don't need to be perfect, and I still use awareness and remind myself that, am I chasing the unattainable goal, and is there something behind this that is stopping me from doing it? Am I gripped by the fear of failure? Am I gripped by the fear of success? Am I gripped by the fear of not being enough? And when we start to learn to ask ourselves these questions each time that perfection shows up in our lives, we start to ask the real questions that enable us to change for the better. So if you'd like to escape the grips of perfection, start to ask yourself some questions. Begin with awareness and learn to grasp the liberation of letting go of perfection. It will make your life lighter. It will make your life more enjoyable. You will be giving other people around you permission to let go of perfection as well. And we can learn to live a much better life, surrounded by people who are prepared to take risks, to expand themselves, prepared to try new things without the fear that underlines failure that's governed by perfection. And what a wonderful world it will look like when we start to see this around us. It's been an absolute pleasure to share with you today about the liberation of letting go of perfection. It's been a joy to share some experiences that I've gained and that I've seen through life, and I hope they support you and help you to release perfectionism from your life so that you can move forward and have the best life possible. If you'd like to know more about mindfulness and how mindfulness can help your life in so many ways, you can subscribe to the channel where this mindfulness meander is that you're listening to, called The Art of Mindful Disruption. If you're a reader and you'd like to read more about mindfulness, you can follow my blog, which is also called The Art of Mindful Disruption. Bring mindfulness into your life, and may you bring joy and release the burdens of things like perfection. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to have you back next time as we travel down a mindful, meandering path together.